Hey everybody, Jay here. Just wanted to let you know that this episode was recorded quite a bit ago prior to a major revision to Steve Tendon's book. So if you are looking for the book that is being discussed in this week's episode, please go to leanpub.com/Tameflow to find the book of Tameflow by Steve Tendon. Enjoy the show.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm happy to be here on the Agile podcast. I was invited to talk about my your workflow and Tameflow in general. I'm very, very glad to be here.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jay Hersko. Joined with me once again, I have a good friend of mine, Ben Al Young. Ben, say hello, Ben.
Hello, nice to be here.
Waving to the camera, Ben, is not great. And we have, for the first time, another friend of mine, Scott Wagner. Scott, greetings.
Greetings.
And for this episode, we are going to be talking about probably the book that made me take more notes. We were talking about it before we started recording. This book has made me take more notes than Dan Vacanti's Actionable Agile Metrics. And it was really one of those mind-awakening experiences. We're going to talk about Tame Your Workflow. And joining us to talk about Tame Your Workflow is the creator of Tameflow himself, Steve Tendon. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm really glad you invited me. I'm looking forward to have this conversation and your questions.
we got plenty for you, Steve. So before we dive into the questions, for listeners who may not be familiar with you or your work, can you give us a little bit of an intro of a bio about what you do, and then you can start talking about the genesis of Tameflow. We can run from there.
Wow, well, that's a long story. I'll try to make it short. But in the previous millennium, I was a software engineer, so that's like the stone age of this field. I started off in the late 80s, early 90s with the legendary Borland company, the makers of Turbo Pascal, Turbo C, and all those products. And that experience shaped a lot of what we today see in Tameflow. The story there is that AT&T was interested in finding ways of developing software in a quicker and better, and they tasked Jim Coplin to do a cross-industry study. And he came across Borland and found that Borland was off the charts in any way you tried to measure the company. Now, this is interesting because the way he approached this was quite unconventional. It was not like a process engineer, which you would expect from AT&T Labs, but it was more from a point of view of, how can you say, a sociologist, an anthropologist, a psychologist, and he used new ways to investigate what made a good company a good company. And there were two things that came out of this. One was a paper about the Borland Quattro Pro for Windows case. And I mentioned this because it was highly influential on Jeff Sutherland and his making of Scrum. So I could say that Tameflow has some common heritage with Scrum due to that study. But the other big thing that came out of Jim's work was the notion of organizational design patterns. Jim is a great scholar of patterns and pattern theory, and he applied it to describing and designing organizations, and in particular organizations that engage in software development, software engineering. I picked that up. I was fascinated by those thoughts and made the pattern thinking the centerpiece of Tameflow. Now, fast forward 25 years and more, and I finally, in 2013-14, decided to give a name to the way I was working, and it became Tame the Flow, or for short, Tameflow. Why? Because I tame 4 flows: the operational flow that most people are familiar with, the financial flow, so how companies make money, the flow of information, so the feedback loops that we are so familiar with in Agile, and last but not least, the most difficult flow of all, which is psychological flow, the one that that American-Hungarian psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I don't know if I pronounced that one right, studied and just said, no, flow is the basis for happiness and optimal experience. So I want to bring people and companies, teams, entire organizations to that optimal experience where they are happy at work, they are hyper performing, and well, the business results just come out of that. So yeah, that's what I think I'm here for, to make people happy.
And I got to tell you, so again, for our listeners, the book we're discussing is Tame Your Workflow. Obviously, we'll have a link to it in the show notes. Ben, we were talking before you joined. This was one of those fear of missing out events where you peer pressured Scott and I. Ben picked it up and said, this book is great. You guys got to read it. So I picked it up. So Scott picked it up and we blasted through it. And it goes without saying that almost everybody has read The Goal, right? Eli Goldenrat's work on theory of constraints. And it almost creates like a cognitive dissonance of, okay, that's manufacturing. How does theory of constraints work in a knowledge delivery, knowledge work situation? And Steve presents a way that he not only makes it work, it seems to the point where he explains it in a way that you stop and you go, well, duh, why am I doing other things and not doing this? But we're not going to drain the book, but I do want to kick off with Ben. You had a couple of good questions. I'm going to start with you and then bounce back and forth to Scott. Let's go in with some of the questions we had for Steve after, reading through Tame Your Workflow.
All right, cool. Yeah, I've got some harder questions that'll hopefully be some good discussion, but I wanted to start off more generally with, so the subtitle of the book is How Dr. Goldratt of The Goal Would Apply the Theory of Constraints to Rethink Knowledge Work Management, which is actually quite unorthodox when you consider the way that most people think nowadays. Most people probably think, theory of constraints does not necessarily apply to knowledge work. So what are they missing? How come it does work for knowledge work? And why are we all sort of misled to thinking that it doesn't, and it's only good for things like manufacturing?
Well, that's a great question, and the answer to that question took the best of the last 10 or 12 years of my life to to pinpoint, and the result is there in the book. So why do we have this mismatch of perception, I would say? Well, because obviously how Dr. Goldratt presented his theory with the goal, it was in a manufacturing situation. But we must not forget that the theory of constraints, now notwithstanding what I have been adding, and we'll get to that in a moment because that is the answer to your question, but we must not forget that the theory of constraints is a huge body of knowledge. Most people read the goal and say, oh yeah, it's about finding the bottleneck, not the constraint, the bottleneck. Shrug of shoulders, yeah, we can do that. We do it all the time, especially if you are in software, you have to find the inner loop and what keeps you back the most. But it's not that simple, because the theory of constraints has evolved a lot since those times, and it has been applied not only to manufacturing, but also to project management, to distribution, to sales, to healthcare, to all sorts of situations. And the thing that allowed Goldratt and the other practitioners of the theory of constraints to extend its reach beyond the manufacturing floor is that part which most people do not know about the theory of constraints, which goes under the name of the thinking processes, where you apply logical thinking to whatever you're trying to resolve. And if you are aiming to reach a goal, by definition, there must be something, by logic, there must be something that holds you back. So you want to apply the thinking, the logic, to find what holds you back. So it's from there that I started. Now it just makes sense. The counter argument there is, if there were not a constraint, well, your productivity would be infinite. Nothing is holding you back, but obviously something is holding you back. So we just need to be able to think and identify what it is that holds us back. And the step, like from the manufacturing floor to knowledge work, is quite a tricky one. Why? Because we have precedents that I would say have failed. David Anderson started off by writing a book on software and theory of constraints. It was the book that introduced me to theory of constraints. And I was fascinated by this theory. Do you know why? Because remember what I said, my work is based on patterns. And in Tameflow, I have come to define like 3 foundational patterns. And one of these foundational patterns is unity of purpose. Why is this so significant? Well, because if you have a bottleneck, a constraint, a single focusing point, you can get all people to gang up around that point. It's like the swarming idea we have often in Scrum and Agile. Now, all are there looking at that single problem. David Anderson eventually introduced Kanban, and if you've seen the latest podcasts by Dan Vacanti, he even tells the story how that happened. Long story short, trying to apply the theory of constraints in a knowledge work setting with the manufacturing mindset is a recipe for failure. And in fact, out of that came Kanban, the Kanban method, not Kanban of Taiichi Ono, and even the history goes back even further, but it's not the Kanban of the Toyota production system or lean. It's the Kanban method that we have in software, so the Kanban boards and so on and so forth. There, the error that most people do is believing that you will find the constraint by looking at the pile-ups in the columns. That is not the case. That is very misleading. But that becomes even a self-fulfilling prophecy that you cannot find the constraint, because how do you try to cope with the situation? Well, you introduce column width limits, but column width limits will just make the situation worse, because one moment it's one column that gives you a signal, the next moment it's the next column, and you are really under the impression that the constraint, the bottleneck, is just jumping around like madness. So there is no way to pinpoint. And remember, step 1 of the theory of constraint is identify the constraint. And if this constraint keeps on moving, there's no point. You don't get a fixed point where to focus. So
that was, Steve, not to cut you off, that was the mind-blowing quote that I dropped in a meeting of a bunch of coaches where we were talking about this directly. And Ben and Scott were both on the call, where I said, one of the things I took out of this book was when you put column width limits, you hide the constraint and you allow it to move, and you don't really see where it is. And you literally saw certain people just sit back in the chair and their head just like exploded because to your point, width limits have been beaten in our head for so long that the idea of taking it off to really see the system as it is was completely foreign. And these are people who were experienced and know what they're talking about.
Yeah, Jay, by the way, please do interrupt me, because when I get started on these topics, I don't stop. I just go on and on. So hold me back, and so we get the chance to ask questions.
It's true testament, and I look at it as a compliment that we get people going and they feel comfortable and they can just keep going. But we will keep that in mind. With that being said, Scott, what's your question? Your first question.
I actually going to do the compliment sandwich. So my question is going to sound kind of negative, but it's not in the least. I love the book. I love the content, but I always go to the people part, right? So when we're establishing mental models, I'm just wondering if you found this harder to actually pull into reality than the book sometimes portrays. And what I would say to that is I also, when we got to the end and we hit the pattern section, I just loved the section. So it kind of gave me some faith that this is true, but I wanted to hear it from you.
No, wonderful question. I don't think it's negative. I think it invites deeper reflection. And on the starting point, Tameflow is based on 4 flows. But the book is primarily on operational flow. Why? Because that's where people feel the most problems. That's what they can relate to. And if you start doing a few things like low-hanging fruits, like improving flow efficiency, um, you have better chances of actually getting traction and people trying out things. But on the psychological side, what is one pattern that I always relate to is what I call the enlightened self-interest pattern. Um, with Tameflow, I wholeheartedly invite people to be absolutely selfish, to think only about themselves. Now, this might sound not quite politically correct because we should be caring and taking care of one another. But the point is, unless my needs are met, my own personal needs are met, um, then I and you now will have to reach a compromise. And a compromise always means that nobody is really happy. We are just making half wins. So the premise here is we want everyone in the company to have their own personal individual needs met first. Start with that in mind, and then relate that to the mental models that you have discovered reading the book, and start to compare those mental models to what might be your own personal needs. The classical one that I always mention is, now you value time. Your time is the most precious thing you have on in life, in this existence we have on planet Earth, and you don't want to waste your time in stressful jobs where you might always be firefighting, where you are always doing overtime, and you don't even have the time to read good books like Tame Your Flow, so you, you you're always under pressure. Now imagine that if you apply these mental models, one thing that comes out is that in order to perform, only Herbie, the constraint, has to work at maximum capacity. All others have to stand still, so they have time on their hand to do other things. I've also often say, if you have nothing to do, don't do anything. Go fishing, go have fun, but don't create more chaos than we already have. It's only Herbie that has to work to the maximum. So, okay, maybe that's an extreme, but you see that applying that mental model, if you're not Herbie, you would say, haha, I see. I could have time and I could use it for something else. That is my interest. So it's the aha moment that is the enlightening. You see the mental model, you see how it relates to your interest, and that's where you get the buy-in. And Tameflow is structured on this mechanism at all levels, from the CEO to the junior hire. So the other thing is that these mental models, we want them to be really a handful, and have them shared across the entire organization. So we don't have the problem that maybe Scrum has, that you need to scale, or that the Agilists have, that, the Agile mindset has to be adopted. And you know what? All those top managers, they just don't get it. Well, you're starting from the wrong end. You must start from the self-interest, the what's in it for me of all the people in the organization, and find ways to, make them pull in the same direction. But you will not do that with any of the, let's say, agile approaches. You will not do it with traditional project management. You will not do it even with management theories. The things that get closest are maybe things like holacracy, maybe things like team science, where you study more how people actually work together. So sociology and anthropology will give you the replies. Tameflow brings all of this together with a handful of mental models where you on the ground might see, oh yeah, I get more time for me. I can study the good stuff. I can help Herbie. and the CEO will say, wow, no, our business performance will improve dramatically. And many of the things you gain business-wise with Tameflow are not in need of investment or restructuring or training. It's just making decisions differently. Why? Because you're enlightened by a new model. You see reality differently.
I love the your usage of the term enlightened, right? Because there's an old saying, I forgot who said it, that altruism doesn't work, but enlightened rational self-interest does. And there's definitely something at play there. We're getting people to change their minds to look about things differently. Man, Steve, there was a lot to unpack in that remark. I mean, you even touched on the idea of low-hanging fruit, and how reducing wasted wait time, right? It's not a thing of, and I think the term you use in the book is, it's not work faster as much as it's deliver sooner. And the best smart, like you said, it doesn't require any capital investment to take a step back, look at your process, figure out where your wait times are, and then look to decrease those to make things
not only is it very easy to do, but the main thing is that by chasing like wait times, and of course there are limits to how much you can do that, but you have lots to gain. By definition, the touch time doesn't change. That means that your way of working does not change at all. So if things don't change, there is a small risk of failure. Why do all the agile transformation, business process improvement, initiatives here, initiatives there, why do they mostly fail? Well, one, because they aim at improving on the touch time, and in doing so, they incur in a lot of risk. So it's very easy to fail. But even if they are successful, the problem is that the touch time they touch, pardon the play on word, is mostly the touch time of the non-Herbies. And we know that from the theory of constraints, does not add anything at all. So that is my explanation why all of these initiatives are just so wasteful. And what happens then? People get burned out. There is like change fatigue. They don't want to see another consultant and another method, and oh no, here we go again.
Right. Ben, you had something?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about a sentiment that's brought up a few times in Reinertsen's Flow book, because he makes quite a distinct point about sort of differentiating. I don't know if he uses the word knowledge work, but he always talks about stochastic processes and how theory of constraints, he claims, does not work for them, because the bottlenecks and constraints move. So he basically makes the case for local Kanban signals that kind of radiate upstream, rather than subordinating the entire system to the constraint, because by time work flows to the constraint, it may have moved. But the way that you've constructed Tameflow, I believe it addresses this particular concern. So could you explain that a little bit, and the alternative point of view from saying that what Reinertsen is saying, that theory of constraints does not apply to stochastic processes?
So first of all, no, I love Reinertsen's work. It's absolutely fantastic. Though yes, he has a few misconceptions about the theory of constraints, and that's probably the only flaw of his work. First, applying deterministic methods in a stochastic context is a recipe for failure. And that's why chasing the constraint on a Kanban board will inevitably fail, because you're looking at the pileups that then just keep on changing and changing. So in that sense, the observation is correct. But that's not the way you should identify the constraint in a stochastic context. In a stochastic context, you should identify the constraint with stochastic methods. And in fact, what do I do? What is the main breakthrough in looking for the constraint on a Kanban board? Well, I look at the flow time distribution, well, across the board. Many will talk about cycle time, lead time. I call it flow time because that was the original term that Dr. Little of Little's Law used. And not only do I look at the flow time distribution across the entire board, but also the flow time distribution in state. So in the single column, what are the flow time distributions? And of course, being a distribution, you can find an average. And these averages have like long-term stability, especially if you start limiting work in process and you get to a stable state like Dan Vacanting teaches. You know, you want the demand line to be parallel to the delivery line. So you have the like your CFD, your cumulative flow diagram is nice and smooth and parallel. Well, in those conditions, the average in-state flow times are very, very stable. So it's easy to find the constraint. You pick the column that has the longest average flow time, and around that column, you build all the thinking of Dr. Goldratt. Now, mind you, in complex knowledge work where you have multiple teams and you have unknown work coming at you, that's not the only way to find the constraint. In fact, in Tameflow, you know, I call that the constraint in the work process. The Kanban board is a work process. But we also look at the constraint in the workflow, which is the work coming towards you. That can change from day to day. One day it's nothing, next day it's a huge pile. And then we must also account for Mr. Herbie. Mr. Herbie. Mr. Murphy. Visiting Herbie. That was a good one. So Mr. Murphy will visit your teams and know your top performing team from one day to the next might just be at a standstill. So we must have a dynamic view of finding where the constraint is at the moment. And that is the constraint in the work execution. Now in the book, I explain how to do this. And if you want, we can go into more details.
Scott, I believe you have a question regarding, I think it's Steve was just leading, he was leading the witness. So
from the point of Q signals, I'm just wondering your take and what you've seen in your experience around overhead in this area, because that tends to be the first place people go when we think fast. We don't think add, we think remove. Have you seen that overhead, and what has your experience been?
So do you mean overhead in terms of resourcing of people, headcount, things like that?
Yeah, because that to me adds that middle layer, and we're trying to really let the flow happen, whereas this to me is top level. So there are many dimensions to this question. First, within the team, the moment you identify a constraint, could be a group within the team, say developers, or if you have multiple teams, it could be a specific team. You are in the situation where if you apply the thinking of lean, you might be tempted to do the wrong thing, because lean in the pursuit of taking away waste will say, okay, Herbie can only walk at 5 kilometers per hour. That's still quite fast. But if the guy in front and the guy after can walk faster, there is stuff in excess. Now, if they get the point that they must not walk faster than Herbie, they will want to eliminate all the capacity that is in excess. That is like a cost accounting exercise. You want to take away the stuff that you don't need. But that is a huge error, because the point of keeping the whole system at the capacity of Herbie is guaranteed only if the non-constraints have protective capacity and even more excess capacity. So you should not be cutting heads
in the name of becoming lean. That is a major, major error, and that protective and excess capacity you should use for other purposes, which also could also be of strategic nature. The other point, which maybe is connected to this and which relates more to the narratives that we have in Agile, is now what do we do with all these mid-managers? They are absolutely useless. They just warm their chairs and give orders, and it's that narrative, and unfortunately, it's the anti-management sentiment that has developed in the Agile space. Well, you all know the story of Herbie, how it goes, and I won't repeat it, but instead of explaining the 5 focusing steps, which was the original purpose of that story, I look at it from another perspective and say that the essence of the story of Herbie is that even if Herbie is the slowest guy, the overweight, and has problems with his shoes, whatever, we leave no man behind. We don't leave anybody behind in the woods. So if in an organization we see that some roles, like mid-managers, are becoming less incisive, why? Because the organization is getting better and faster and slimmer because we're doing all the things we're saying in the book. Well, we don't fire them. We find a way to value what they know and maybe retrain or repurpose. I don't know what the right word is, but we do not leave anyone behind. We will maybe take that as a golden opportunity that we have resources available that could do other things and stuff.
Oh, I like it. So, Steve, I guess to jump, and this will bring us full circle right back to where we're standing. So in the beginning, you talked about Whiffam, which to me is kind of like the opposite of Covey. He wants to go to the end. We're talking start in the beginning, right? Understand the people, start there. So with DBR schedule, you have a piece in here that mentions in most companies, there's simply not sufficient stability to manage queues in this fashion. So I'm trying to understand that piece as well as reading end to end how much this works. So from a tooling perspective, how do those two kind of not conflict with each other?
I'm not quite sure I understood the question. Could you maybe rephrase it?
Well, it basically says it takes deliberate top-down decision to adopt DBR scheduling. It talks about metal models. And then it goes into that last piece about there is simply not sufficient stability to manage queues in this fashion in most companies. So
yes,
are we saying that we really need to really get to DBR before we put it in place?
Yeah, it is a chicken and egg problem. So the fact is that DBR is really counterintuitive, and if you try to implement it like by yourself in your little team, and maybe you're in a large corporation with many teams, you will not gain a lot out of it. Well, as a matter of fact, what often happens is that that your team will improve so much that it will stand out. It will stand out so much that the surrounding context, the other teams, the other managers might start like deliberately sabotaging. Why? Because you make them look bad. And you know how it works in silos. You have KPIs, and all of a sudden there is an imbalance there. So that's something to consider. The only way DBR can work is if it is put in relation to the enlightened self-interest of top guy, the CEO and CFO, where they might really understand that by exercising these decisions of when to start and stop work in a different manner, the company will make more money, which that is their mission. You get to those positions because you have to make more money. And at that point, you have like the preconditions for this to happen. The top guys will want this to happen. And you mentioned the patterns before at the end of the book, and one pattern to get started is quite different from what you would do, like, let's say in Scrum, where you start with a team and then you scale upwards, or in Lean, where you do like a big bang, change everything everywhere at the same time, very much top down. What I suggest in Tameflow is that you focus on a slice, a bit like in Agile, you want to exercise the whole stack of your application. Well, you start with a team, you go through all the managers from that team up to the top, and you get all of them involved. So it's like a vertical slice of the organization. That's where Tameflow starts. And when the top manager sees the impact of working that way, well, then it can fan out horizontally and arrive at the other units and teams. But there is still one point: stability. That is also one of the key points of Goldratt. You know, there is this tension in the company between growth and stability. Unless you have a stable situation, you will not be able to do the metrics to find the constraint. What I mentioned before, remember I said that we need the CFDs to be nice and parallel. That is a sign of stability, which means limit work in process. So there you have the circle, the chicken and egg. So you have to be good at that.
So one of the things you touched on, Steve, which I think we could do an entire episode on, is the idea of throughput accounting, right? Where do I invest my money? And this was another one of those, like, you know, Ben does the exploding brain emoji, right? This is another one of those things that made my brain reset, is when there's a remark in the book of any money not invested in the constraint is basically money wasted. You're throwing money down a hole, right? Any money invested in not invested in optimizing the constraint, right? Which ties to the idea of throughput accounting, where I'm sure every single person has been in an organization where they spend an outsized amount of time trying to figure out the budget for next year and the allocations, and it's painful and brutal. And, you know, we try to do some voodoo chicken waving to figure out how much money we're going to spend. So let me ask you this, Steve, in regards to the practice of throughput accounting, looking at your throughput versus your operational expense versus your investment, why does it seem that this is such a hard concept to grasp for a lot of organizations? Because I'm under the assumption that they teach this in MBA courses, but then it gets kind of lost by the wayside when people come out of their MBA school and it's cost accounting, one methodology to rule them all. Why do you think throughput accounting runs into that lack of adoption?
Well, first of all, they do not teach this stuff in the MBA courses. So that's a huge gap. And it's pretty much a mental model gap. They don't teach it in accounting schools, not in MBAs, almost nowhere. So, of course, it is always perceived as an esoteric voodoo practice, as you mentioned. The fact is that if a conventional cost accountant is to make a management decision with the tools they are equipped with, they will almost always invariably arrive at the complete opposite decision of throughput accounting. And the fact is that if you try to go through the steps and like handhold them, they will often jump to the conclusion that their choice is correct, that there is no need to further elaborate the case. But they are missing that if they just walk another 3 or 4 or 5 steps down that dark path that we just hinted at, they would find the pot of gold. So it is like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They don't they see their obvious conclusion before they have seen the whole story, and because they know the conclusion from their point of view, they are not open to explore the rest. So that's where we need to be very how can we say, delicate in a way in the way we present this topic, because it's very easy to immediately provoke a rejection, a reaction. So no, this is not interesting. So that's the only way to do that I know of, is to do some whiteboard exercises and have the narrative of this is what we want. We want the unity of purpose, and how do we get there? Well, we don't want to have conflicts. And you know what? The primary financial exercise in companies is budgeting. What is budgeting? It's warfare. It's everyone against everyone. Last man standing. Who gets the largest slice of the pie? And then you have all those games. Not only is my budget larger than yours, but if I don't spend all of my budget this year, I will get less next year, right? And all these bad behaviors that are induced by the process. So by starting from there, we might say, well, if we just look at the numbers differently, we might create a situation where instead of having these infights and instead of wasting our energy and nervous stress basically fighting one another, we can put that energy in winning into the markets. These are the arguments that you start bringing in, and maybe then people start to listen. It would be nice, but it's impossible. Well, let's see. Let's look at the numbers, and then you start bringing in the numbers, and after a few exercises, you come to the throughput accounting element, and then you have again the enlightened self-interest. Yes, we do make more money. Let's do it. Why didn't we do it before?
That is absolutely perfect. And I want to be conscious of time, Steve. We're quickly approaching the cutoff. And I know that I speak for Ben and Scott, where we could literally go on for another 6 hours just picking apart every single chapter. So I wanted to ask you, Steve, two questions. First question is, where can readers find you and more information if they want to dig into Tameflow? Obviously, I'm going to do some links in the show notes. And secondly, I want to know what's next. What's next for Steve Tendon and Tameflow?
So to find me, maybe the easiest way is on Twitter, where I am at Tendon, Tendon. They can check out the Tameflow corporate site, which is tameflow.com. There you'll find information about the books. You will find my blogs, which go back to 2011-12. A lot of the blogs were like the raw material that then became the first book. You will find links to, I also have a YouTube channel, the Campfire Talks with Herbie, where I often invite practitioners of all other schools of thought, and we have great conversations there. You will find the training offerings and much more. You also find me on LinkedIn. Just search for Steve Tendon. I'm the only one, I guess. At least last time I checked, I was the only one. And then what's next for Tameflow? Well, the website I just mentioned got to its current shape and form more or less 1 year ago when I and Daniel published this book. And for me, it was like, okay, done. Let's go on with what I usually do, because you might know I'm also quite engaged in the blockchain space. I've been doing lots of stuff in blockchains. But Daniel, came to me and said, you know what, you really have to bring this to market and offer an alternative to all the scrums and kanbans and safes and all of those. And I said, yeah, why not? Let's do that. So the next phase of Tameflow is after having developed the approach, the method of Tameflow, I want to bring this to a broader audience. So let's say the business of Tameflow. That's what I'm working on now.
That's awesome.
And by the way, the trainer program that we have, if you are an agile coach or trainer and want to take the next step, well, come to Tameflow. We're going to amaze you. It's going to be awesome.
I think you may see an email from a Ben, a Jay, and a Scott later expressing interest in that exact thing.
Wow, great.
Steve, on behalf of Ben, Scott, and all of our listeners, I really want to thank you for taking the time. This has been a really, really awesome conversation. I haven't taken this many quotes and notes in quite a bit. And on behalf of all of us, I want to thank all of you listeners for tuning in again. If you like what you heard, give us a review, a rating on your podcast listening platform of choice. We also have a very vibrant international Discord community. So hop on in. It doesn't matter where you're located. It doesn't matter what time zone you're in. Come in and join the conversation. We have a lot of really good convos going on there. And lastly, but not least, the obligatory Patreon call out. We do have a Patreon. We are committed to always being free. But if you feel like chipping in and offsetting some hosting costs or production costs, maybe you'll get a surprise from me in the mail. Maybe you'll get a whole bunch of stickers that you can stick on your laptop and start great conversations with other coworkers. So once again, on behalf of Ben and Scott and myself, I want to thank you, Steve. On behalf of all of us, I want to thank you, listeners. And until next time, this is the Agile Uprising Podcast, signing out.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.